Shalom and welcome to Return the Remnant Ministry. This teaching is part 2 of our two-part teaching concerning the land Sabbath, the Jubilee, and chronology. If you have not watched part 1, I would strongly suggest going back and watching that, because that teaching deals with how we are to count the Jubilee and the land Sabbath, when to begin the count, and what we are to do in the 7th year. If you've already watched that teaching, let's begin the second part of our teaching concerning the chronology and where we're at on the timeline that Yahweh has appointed for mankind. If you would turn to Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, it is written, "And Yahweh said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. My question to you is, do you know anyone in the last 50, 100 years who has lived to be 120 years? I can't think of anyone. I know some people on the news that we find out that people have lived to be 114, 115 years old, but I don't know anyone that's lived to be 120. So, let's take a look at that word in our English Bibles translated in English as years. Is it years in this particular verse, or is it something else? If we look up the Strong's Concordance, H8141, we see that the Hebrew word here is shaneh, or shana. In its noun form, we can see that it can represent a year, it can represent a whole age, X amount of years long, old, but most importantly, it's a cycle or revolution of time. Now, there's many people out in the Messianic community and in Judaism who say that, well, this is talking about a Jubilee, and they're correct. I believe that they are correct. But where I think many people are in error is that they think there's 120 Jubilees and they're in 50-year cycles, meaning that there's 6,000 years is what Yahweh's timeline for man. I agree. I used to think this way. Nice and sweet. 120 times 50, 6,000. Very nice rounded numbers. But as I showed you in the first part of this teaching, there's 120 Jubilees, but they're in 49-year cycles, with the 50th year being the first year of the next Jubilee cycle. This would equal to 5,880 years. So, with that in mind, when will the next Shmittah and Jubilee occur according to biblical chronology? I've already gone through and given the dates. Much of this information I had gotten from Joseph Dumont from CitedMoon.com website, and I would encourage you to go to his website when you have time and take a look at some of the research that he has put together. We have, as far as the Jubilees go, we had our 119th Jubilee in 1996 and the last Jubilee in 2045. Now, this chart that I'm showing here shows in detail how 1996 was the 119th Jubilee, which is also the first year of the last Jubilee, according to Yahweh's timeline for man. And we can see that the first Shemitah, the first land Sabbath, happened in 2002. The second Jubilee, the second land Sabbath occurred in 2009. And the third land Sabbath, the third Shemitah, is going to happen in 2016. Right now we're in the year 2013, and we have 2 more years before the Shemitah year comes. The following chart that I've got here shows the years from the creation of Adam to the end date of 5,881, which marks the 120th Yovel, or Jubilee, completing Yahweh's timeline for man. Notice that the Jubilee years are numbered 1 to 120, and next to each Jubilee is a corresponding year from the creation of Adam. So, over here in the top left corner of the chart, you see the start date of 1. We know that Adam was created on the 6th day. We also know that Adam lived to be, I think, roughly 930 years. I may be off a couple years. But if you follow the numbers down, you can see that he died around the end of the 18th Jubilee before the 19th Jubilee cycle. You can see that. You can see that the 19th Jubilee started in 932 years after Adam was created. So all these numbers here you see, starting up from 50 to 5,881, is all the years from the creation of Adam. That is the timeline according to Genesis 6:3. Now notice I have 4 areas that are highlighted, 4 sets of numbers that are highlighted and in bold. And just to give it to you straight, the 2,206 years after the creation of Adam is the year when Jacob fled Laban, had his encounter with the Malach Elohim, with the angel, the messenger of Elohim, and overcame Esau and crossed over into the land, into the promised land, the land of Canaan. We also see that happened in the 45th Jubilee. And the 46th Jubilee is the year that Jacob died, that Jacob passed away in Egypt. And if you look down at the 2500, that is the year the children of Israel crossed the Jordan, just like their forefather Jacob did, following the pattern. They crossed over on the 51st Jubilee into the promised land. And then you see here 64th Jubilee, 3137. Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this next chart you see, we know from Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11 and throughout the rest of Genesis, the 24 generations, starting with Adam and continuing all the way down to Jacob. Again, take a look at the 2255. That is when Jacob passed away in Egypt. We see all the dates here. We notice that Abraham was born 1,948 years after Adam. We know that the Genesis 15 covenant with Abraham was made when Abraham was 80 years old in the year 2028 after Adam. Exodus chapter 12 verse 41, the children of Israel left Egypt exactly 430 years later to the very day in the year 2458 after Adam. And we know that according to Scripture, Leviticus 25 verse 2, Yahweh instructs Moshe to tell the children of Israel that when they come into the land shall keep a Sabbath unto Yahweh. Okay, so just going back just a little bit, Genesis 15, we are not told how old Abraham was when he made the covenant with him and Yahweh. We don't know. What we do know is he was 75 years old when he left Padam Aram, as quoted in Genesis chapter 12, and we know later that Ishmael was born when he was 86 years old. So there has to be an equation here that we know that between the year 75, when Abraham was 75 years old, and 85 years old, somewhere in between those, we know that the covenant was made. And we see that from that time the covenant was made, which was during Passover, unleavened bread, to the very same day that we see here in Exodus 12:41, it says that they left exactly on the 430 years later on the same day, which would have been the first day of unleavened bread. Okay? But in Genesis 15 it says that Abraham's seed would be afflicted for 400 years. So not Abraham, but his seed. That seed being the promised son, being Isaac. So if you take a look, we have to understand, when did Isaac start to be afflicted? And it has to line up with 400 years, and Abraham has to line up with 430 years, to the same day when they left. Okay? So the only date that fits this, I've done the homework, you can search it out for yourself. This is also, you can go to Joseph DeMond's website, sightedmoon.com. He goes into this as well. Also, he has a really good book, Remembering the Sabbatical Years of 2016, where he explains this in a lot of detail. But just bear with me that he had to have been 80 years old when the covenant was made. That started the 430 years from Genesis 15. And then when Isaac was 10 years old, it says that Isaac was weaned in Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 10. There was a big party, and we know that the son of Hagar, which is Ishmael, was mocking Isaac. Well, again, we have no understanding, we have very little understanding with ancient covenants and ancient Near East language. And so when we talk about a child today being reared or being weaned, we come up with different ages. But in order for this to fit, Isaac was 10 years old and Abraham was 110 when the 400 years of affliction started with his son. It's the only way it fits. It's the only number that fits. So that when you come up 430 years later from the Genesis 15 covenant, it all lines up. Okay, so now this chart that I have goes into a little bit more detail to show the difference in the years from Adam, which is the top line. The second line shows the 430 years of affliction, and then also we see three highlighted areas that talk about when Jacob overcame Esau and came into the land of Canaan, where Jacob passes away in Egypt, and the 2,500 years after Adam when Israel enters the Promised Land. It's a pattern. A lot of this information I got not only out of the Bible but also out of the book of Jasher. Some of the information in the middle, I wouldn't get into too much of that. Just the bottom line is the 430 years from Genesis 15 has to line up with later, a future date, where the 400 years of affliction start with Isaac, and they have to line up together so that the children of Israel leave in the year 2458 after the creation of Adam and end up in the land of Israel on a Jubilee year, on a Yovel year. It's the only date that fits. Now, interestingly, in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 29, we have a key verse here. We're given a marker. Yahweh is giving us a marker, which is huge. This will be a shock to you. It's just like when we read our Bibles 50, 60 times, we go over the same verse, and then all of a sudden it comes on like a light bulb. This is another one of those verses. But you have to first understand what the land Sabbath is about and the Jubilee, what they're about, so that you'll understand what this verse is about. 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 29. Before I get into reading this verse, just a quick recap. During this time, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, was invading Judah. And he was in the Judean area, and he actually was having a battle at Lachish. And he sent one of his messengers to Jerusalem to let them know that he's coming, and to let them know that they need to surrender, and basically mocking the Elohim of Israel, saying that their God would not save them, just like all the other gods of the other nations didn't save them. Well, at this time Hezekiah was king of Judah. He heard this, tore his clothes, prayed to Yahweh. Yahweh heard his prayer, and Yahweh sent word to Isaiah to tell Hezekiah the following verse. And this shall be a sign unto you, Hezekiah. You shall eat this year such things as grow themselves, and in the second year that which springs of the same, and in the third year sow, reap, and plant vineyards, and eat the fruits thereof. So, if you've listened to the first part of this teaching, you should know right away what this is in regards to. This sign is none other than a 7th year Shmittah, land Sabbath, followed by a Yovel, a Jubilee. It's incredible. Read it again. Look at it again. This is a key verse, key marker. Now, the Sennacherib prism, or the Taylor prism, which was found in 1830 amongst the ruins of Sennacherib's palace, which is in modern-day Iraq, gives account of the victory battles of the Assyrian king. And many scholars and historians date Sennacherib's campaign against the kingdom of Judah at 701 BC. So, if we chart this out, 701 BC is the 49th year, the 7th sabbatical, followed by 700 BC, which is the 50th year, the Jubilee or the Yovel, and then the year following that, 699 BC, is the year following the Jubilee. And I would strongly suggest, if you have time, to go to do a Google search for Kadesh La Yahweh Press, and the name of the book is The Sabbath and Jubilee Cycle. And this is a very, very important book that goes into detail about Sennacherib's campaign, Hezekiah, and it gives strong support for a 701 BC being the Shmittah year, the 7th Shmittah year, and 700 BC being the Yovel or Jubilee. So, if we're to plug those dates in to 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 29, this is how it should read. And this shall be a sign unto you. You shall eat this year, 701 BC, Shmittah, such things as grow of themselves, and in the second year, 700 BC, the Yovel, that which springs of the same, and in the third year, 699 BC, the year after the Yovel or the Jubilee, you can sow, reap, and plant vineyards and eat the fruits thereof. So based on just that verse of Scripture, and the Assyrian records verified through archaeology, we see that 700 BC was a Yovel, a Jubilee year. And if we add 49-year cycles from that point, it'll bring us to the last Jubilee, which happened in 1996. And you can see on that chart there, I've highlighted 700 BC, and then going in 49-year cycles, you'll see that 1996 was a year, and 2045 was a year. Interestingly, 1947 was a Jubilee. And in that year, what happened? The decree that Israel could become a nation again was enacted by the UN, and people started going back to their inheritance, just like in the Jubilee year. Now, remember, when you're trying to figure this out on your own, keep in mind that there is not a zero between the dates of -1 BC and 1 CE. There's no zero there. You'll go from 1 BC to 1 CE. Okay, now, this is very interesting, and this will help prove my point about 49-year cycles. This chart here explains the known historical recorded Shemitah years. And again, this information can be discussed in detail by Kadesh La Yahweh Press, the Sabbath and Jubilee cycle, and they have this online in PDF form. You can download it for free. I've actually printed it off. It's a very, very good book, very in-depth. I highly encourage you to download it and read it and study it out. So we see that there are 12 known historical recorded Shemitah years, or in a Jubilee in there. We know that from the 2 Kings 1929, we know the 701 BC, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked Judah, okay, that was a Shemitah year, and 700 BC was the Jubilee or Yovel year. We know that in 456 BC, Nehemiah reads the Torah as instructed in Deuteronomy chapter 31, 10 through 13, and we find that in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 18. In 162 BC was a Shemitah year, and that can be verified through 1 Maccabees chapter 16, verse 14, and in Josephus' Antiquities. We also see in 134 BC another Shemitah year, which can be found in 1 Maccabees and in Josephus' Antiquities. And it's interesting because during this time there was the Hasmonean dynasty. And in 134 BC, John Hyrcanus was was king at that time, king of Judah. And his, if I have the story correct, his mother and some of his relatives were taken hostage, kidnapped, and taken back to a stronghold in Jericho. And the enemy had him there, and John Hyrcanus chased after him and built siege works and tried very earnestly to lay siege upon the city and rescue his family members. But very interestingly, you'll read in Scripture that he had to send his troops home. And he sent them home because it was very, very close to the 7th year land Sabbath. I find that very, very interesting. We have another date, 43 B.C., Julius Caesar and Josephus' Antiquities. 36 B.C., 22 B.C., 42 Common Era. These can all be verified through Josephus' Antiquities. In the year 56 Current Era, there's a recorded debt in year 2 reign of Nero Caesar. 70 CE was a Sabbath year, the destruction of the temple. And we have two other dates, 133 CE and 140 CE, which deal with rental contracts at the beginning of the Bar Kokhba revolt and at the end, towards the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And interestingly enough, when my wife and I were in Jerusalem in May of 2013, we were at the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, and I really enjoyed the synagogues and looking at the history, and so does she. And it just so happens that she stumbled upon a couple gravestones, a couple tombstones that were found in the Dead Sea region of Zoar. And so we didn't think much of it, but we took a couple pictures of these tombstones, and one of them, I'll give you one of them here. It says, translated, it says, "May the soul of Hasadiah, the priest, son of Demetin, rest, who died on Thursday, the 5th of Av, in the 4th year of the Shmittah cycle," which is year 445 after the destruction of the temple. Shalom al Israel, shalom, peace on Israel, peace. So, it's interesting that people who died after the destruction of the temple, that the years were so many years after the destruction of the temple. Well, we know that the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. 70 CE plus 445 gives you 515 years, right? 515 CE. Interestingly, again, Joseph Dumas in his Prophecies of Abraham book has an excellent chart, I think. It's very thorough, that shows, again, on his chart, that this is indeed the 4th year of the Shemitah cycle in 515, showing that he has 2 more markers. We have 14 markers of evidence now to show that the Jubilee year is in 49-year cycles. So that was one tombstone, and then another one that was dated 369 years after the destruction of the temple. Add 70 years to that, you come to 439 Common Era. And that was another Zohar tombstone inscription that said the 5th year of the Shemitah. And you know what? It lines up to the year. So, during Sukkot this past year, we were able to spend some time with Joseph Dumas, and it was an excellent find for us, and it helped solidify what he's been talking about. And he about went through the roof in our pop-up. It was pretty neat. So, we can also find some other historical sources to help validate some of the things we're talking about. We have 4 Assyrian chronologies called Eponym that go from 911 BC to 701 BC. We have 7 Assyrian chronologies called Limu, which go from the years 872 BC to 660 BC. We also have, for a historical source, Ptolemy's Canon, which is a chronology of Babylonian kings from 747 BC up to 161 Common Era. And not only that, even more importantly, Ptolemy also had over 80 astronomical recordings. This is significant, very huge, people, because we can go back through astronomical programs, and we can find out when some of these recordings were recorded and help us verify certain dates in history. So, based on what I just showed you, of not only the 12 historical markers, but the 2 more that were found. And by the way, there's at least another 50 inscriptions found at Zoar. And if anyone knows where they're at, if anyone can give me information on it, I would certainly enjoy looking at them, because I want to see more dates. They all line up. Okay, now this chart that I have here is just a bunch of numbers. It's going to look confusing. But basically what I did is I took, out of the 120 Jubilees, we know we have 7 land Sabbaths, right? 7 land Sabbaths and then a Jubilee, correct? And we're in cycles of 7. So, if we have 120 Jubilees, multiply that by 7, we have 840 Shmittah, 840 land Sabbaths in Yahweh's creation, in Yahweh's timeline for man, from the creation of Adam until the last Jubilee. So you can see here, I have in the blue the before Common Era in the BC range, and then I have in the pink Common Era. And you can see in the top left I have year 7, year 14, 21, etc., going all the way down. So there's 840 numbers on here, okay? And you can see some dates I have blocked. 2,499 Shemitah year, 3136, 3381. These are all years after the creation of Adam. Now, this is just a bunch of numbers, but when you overlay it with the next chart I'm going to show you, you can see that in 1338, that was the Shemitah year before the children of Israel crossed over into the land of Israel in 1339 BC. We have 1337 BC. We have 701 BC, which is the Shemitah year, which is we found in 2 Kings 19:29. That is the year before the Jubilee. 456 BC. Again, all these that I have in bold are on Shemitah years that we have documented historical evidence to support. So you can see 43 BC, 36 BC, 22 BC, 42 CE, 56 CE, 70 CE, 133, 140. All these match. They all line up in a 40-year Jubilee cycle. If you use a 50-year Jubilee cycle, it won't line up. It will not line up. So, why is it important that we keep the Shemitah and the Yovel? We know the Israelites were exiled for not only disobeying Yahweh's Torah, but for not observing the Shemitah year or the Yovel. The land was not given its rest. Servants were not set free. Debts were not canceled. But we read in Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 28 to 31, of all the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who were living in Assyria and then later Babylon, only a small remnant came out of Babylon back to Israel, about 40,000 originally. And what happened? Nehemiah says the following, chapter 10, 28 to 31. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and we would leave, let alone, the 7th year, Shemitah, and the exaction of every debt. When the children of Israel, that remnant, came back, they were zealous on keeping the land Sabbath. They wanted to show Yahweh they would keep it, and we can see, even all the way up to 515 current era, there were people in Judea, in Israel, that were keeping the land Sabbath. Maybe not collectively as an entire nation, but there were people doing it and continuing to do it even up till today. I said all that to say this: if you love the Elohim of Israel and desire to obey His instructions and keep His Torah, then this commandment for the Shemitah and the Yovel is like the Sabbath and holy days, holy to Yahweh. And we see again in Exodus chapter 23, verse 11, it is written, "But the 7th year you shall let alone the land, let it rest and lie still, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner you shall deal with your vineyard and with your olive garden." Leviticus chapter 25, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land. Key in on this. A Sabbath for you, a Sabbath for Yahweh. So by doing what Yahweh says, which includes observing the Shmittah and Yovel, here's what He's going to do for you if you keep it. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 18 to 21. Wherefore you shall do my statutes and keep my judgments and do them, and you shall dwell in the land in safety, and the land shall yield her fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and dwell therein in safety. And if you shall say, what shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow, nor gather in our increase. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. Also, Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 22 to 27. This is the rewards for obedience, part of it. For if you are careful to keep all this commandment which I am commanding you, to do it, to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all His ways and hold fast to Him, then Yahweh will drive out all these nations from before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot shall tread shall be yours. Your border shall be from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, as far as the western sea. There shall no man be able to stand before you. Yahweh your Elohim shall lay the dread of you and the fear of you on all the land on which you set foot, as He has spoken to you. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you shema, if you listen to the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I am commanding you today. Isn't that awesome? That is awesome. I don't know about you, but I want to do it. And I want to do it the best I can, because I want to see that blessing from Yahweh. I want to see Yahweh bless the land, bless me, bless my family. And I hope you do as well. In Romans chapter 8, verse 19, Paul writes, For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of Yahweh. The earth is waiting for you and me to get ready. The earth, the rest of Yahweh's creation, is waiting for us to get our act together. In Psalm chapter 90, verse 12, it is written, So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. We are right now in the 12th month, the 6th day, the 4th year of the 3rd Shemitah cycle, in the 119th Jubilee. Let's start understanding how to count and number our days and follow Yahweh's reckoning of time. It should be our desire to love and obey our Heavenly Father. We need to keep His commandments. Keeping the Shmittah and the Yovel is another commandment we need to keep, regardless if we live in the land of Israel or not. Let's all try our best to follow after Yahweh and keep His commandments. That includes keeping the land Sabbath and the Jubilee. If you'd like any more further reading on this subject, again, I would encourage you to go to Yahweh.org and download the PDF version of the Sabbath and Jubilee Cycle by Kadesh Yahweh Press. Another good book to read is Edwin R. Thiel, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, which Edwin Thiel goes into great detail talking about the kings. It's good for chronology. The Prophecies of Abraham is one book by Joseph Duman, where he has a really good chart in there, I think, that really gives you a better understanding of what I'm trying to share today. Also, Remembering the Sabbatical Years of 2016 by Joseph Duman. And another website which I think is good concerning the next sabbatical year. And you can go to setapartpeople.com. I hope and pray that this teaching was a blessing. Again, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, you can reach us at returnofthерemnant.com or by email at returnoftheremnant@gmail.com.